This video is made possible by Morning Brew. Start your day by catching up on the top news in business, finance, and tech in 5 minutes by subscribing with a link down in the description. Venice is one of the world's most well-known and visited cities. With over 5.5 million tourists who visited and stayed the night in 2019, Venice received 21 times as many tourists as their native population, and despite only being home to about 260,000 people, about the same number as live in Lubbock, Texas, Venice is visited more often than cities that are significantly larger, like Moscow, Madrid, Munich, Johannesburg, or Toronto. To put it into another perspective, during 2019, the city of Venice, with a population that's not even 260,000 people, received 86% of the same number of overnight tourists as the entire country of Brazil did, with a population of over 212 million people. There's just something magical about this small city that's captured the imagination of generations across centuries. Perhaps it's the fact that even now in the 21st century, it's remained the final large urban environment in Europe that has survived without cars or trucks, and has continued to rely instead upon simple walking and boats, as they have for thousands of years. Or perhaps it's the sheer and ancient beauty of the canals and buildings themselves in the city that many consider to be a living museum, full of masterpieces from a bygone era that still speak to our souls today. But unfortunately, both for Venice and the world, Venice has two massive problems. The entire city is drowning, and too many people are coming to watch it die. These are all video clips that have been taken just in the past few years of a city at war with water. And the water has been getting stronger and stronger. Recently, Venice has been getting flooded more than 60 times a year. And during the worst of these floods, as much as 80% of the entire city could find itself a little bit underwater. And then there's the number of people coming to see it. Before the pandemic shut the world down in 2020, 2019 was the peak year for tourism in Venice. While 5.5 million tourists visited and actually spent at least one night within the city that year, 19 million more tourists visited and spent less than a day there. And Venice itself is really tiny. It's only about 5 square kilometers in area, and with nearly 26 million people visiting in a single year, that means that at any given time in 2019, there was nearly 1 tourist for every 3 residents in the city. These problems have been getting worse and worse every year now for decades. But in order to fully understand why this is happening now and what's being done to save the city, you've got to understand some of the city's history. First of all, the strategic location of Venice on an island in the center of a lagoon has long offered it security and protection from outside powers. Before the 5th century AD, the lagoon itself was a relatively isolated and swampy backwater of the Roman Empire. But when the Huns and Germanic peoples began their invasions of the Italian peninsula, it generated one of the ancient world's greatest refugee crises. And many of these refugees sought the precious safety that was offered inside of the Venetian lagoon. The lagoon is the largest wetland or marshy environment found anywhere around the Mediterranean Sea, and the dozens of islands scattered across it that rise above the shallow water offered immensely valuable protection across the water from the marauding bands of Germans and Huns back over on the mainland. And over time, the lagoon itself would become the well-protected cradle for one of the most powerful and influential civilizations in history. For out of these islands gradually evolved the absurdly rich Venetian Republic and her massive maritime commercial empire. The lagoon itself offers multiple advantages for the home base of a maritime-based civilization. The waters around the city provide a natural moat that any would-be invaders have to successfully cross first. Further, the waters around the city inside of the lagoon are generally calm because it's a shallow bay that's almost entirely enclosed from the rest of the Mediterranean Sea, with only these 3 possible entrances from the outside, meaning that the lagoon is a fantastic natural harbor for parking ships in. The position of Venice inside of the safety of the lagoon, and the position of the lagoon at the very tippy top of the Adriatic Sea, enabled the city an incredibly safe base of operations from which to build ships in peace, and from which to launch them out in war. This geographic advantage enabled the city of Venice over time to dominate the entire Adriatic and, from there, over time, the entire Mediterranean Sea as well. Eventually, by the 14th century, the city had constructed the Venetian arsenal, a massive shipyard that at its height took up 15% of the entire city and was the largest industrial complex found anywhere in Europe prior to the Industrial Revolution. By almost independently inventing the assembly line nearly 600 years before Henry Ford, the Venetians were capable of producing fully equipped merchant or naval vessels at a rate of one every day, something that was completely unprecedented anywhere else in the world in the medieval and Renaissance eras. Through this process granted by their geographic advantages, the Venetians eventually assembled a fleet of more than 3,000 ships, which they at first used to completely safeguard their city surrounded by a moat separated from the mainland, and then to dominate the entire Adriatic and Mediterranean seas, carving out colonies across the Adriatic coast, along with a sizable chunk of Greece and Cyprus. By dominating the Mediterranean, the Venetians completely monopolized the flow of trade coming into Europe from the east. And with their interesting location just south of the strategic Brenner Pass through the Alps, they could easily funnel their goods both across Italy and north through the mountains to Germany and beyond to the rest of Europe. Venice's geography all but guaranteed that it would become medieval Europe's principal center of commerce and trade, and it quickly became the wealthiest city on the entire continent. But a series of increasingly unfortunate events completely changed the entire calculus of power. First of all, the Venetians all on their own decided to confront the significantly more powerful and rising Ottoman Empire and lost against them repeatedly, gradually losing more and more of their colonial possessions across the Mediterranean in the process. Second, Venice's strategic location that enabled it to dominate trade from the east was only as good as the knowledge of the world map. And as the Portuguese began exploring more and more of it in the 16th century, they were able to completely undermine Venice's prior advantage. Venice had spent centuries concentrating on building galleys that relied upon oars, the perfect ships for moving across the calm waters of an inland sea like the Mediterranean, but pretty terrible for moving across the unpredictable and often harsh waters of the open ocean. Venice was unable to adapt and therefore became locked inside of the Mediterranean and missed out on the European rush for colonies across other continents. And when the Portuguese discovered the Cape of Good Hope for the Europeans, their larger and more ocean-worthy ships ended up dominating the Indian Ocean itself, and the trade from the east shifted towards Portugal and other powers from there, forever destroying Venice's prior monopoly and the source of her vast wealth. Venice's influence waned and waned across the following centuries until Venice itself was conquered by the French, and then passed back and forth between them and the Austrians for a while, before finally becoming a part of the modern nation-state of Italy itself. For more than 5 centuries now since Vasco da Gama discovered the Cape of Good Hope and opened up the Indian Ocean directly to European trade, Venice has never again managed to regain its prior historical significance. And now, today in the 21st century, the city is facing these new modern crises that threaten its entire existence once again. Let's begin with the flooding issue. Obviously, a city that's literally surrounded by water like Venice will have a flooding problem from time to time, much like New Orleans in the United States. But Venice is located in a uniquely flood-vulnerable area. It's located in the lagoon at the very top of the Adriatic Sea, while the Adriatic's long, narrow, and rectangular shape amplifies the natural tides moving up it, meaning that the Adriatic naturally has substantially more extreme tidal events than the rest of the Mediterranean does, and the Adriatic pretty much funnels them all up right towards Venice. Further, the strong northbound winds in the area whipping off the Adriatic blow directly towards the 3 connections between the lagoon and the sea, which can significantly slow down or even totally block the water outflow from the lagoon into the sea. And when that happens, the ebb of water is blocked inside of the lagoon, and the next high tide that comes in overlaps with the previous one, which just kind of perpetuates this vicious, self-supporting cycle of flood. And to make matters even worse, Venice is located atop the Adriatic tectonic plate, which is currently in the process of shifting beneath the Italian coast, meaning that Venice is naturally sinking and losing elevation in an area that's already highly prone to flooding. But in addition to these natural problems, humans have of course been making even more man-made problems for themselves as well. Had the Venetian lagoon simply been left to itself and to nature over the past 1,000 years, it probably would have completely filled up with silt by now because of the various major sediment-rich rivers that used to flow into it. And Venice would have been more or less loosely connected to the mainland. The medieval Venetians were well aware of this problem, and unwilling to allow Venice's greatest defensive asset to be destroyed like this, they began diverting the rivers away from the lagoon to keep the sediment out and to keep Venice enclosed by water. Over time, this made the waters inside of the lagoon deeper and deeper and increased the scale of Venice's moat, and therefore increased their safety from the mainland, but it also made flooding of the city itself worse as well because, well, there was just a higher volume of water around it. And then in the 19th century, the Italians built a railroad bridge that connected Venice over to the mainland. And this was even further expanded in the 1930s by the construction of a road bridge alongside of it, all of which significantly modified the natural motion of the water inside of the lagoon. And in the 20th century, the Italian government created an industrial district immediately behind Venice, and it made the flooding problems even worse. Previously to the industrial district's construction, the area was covered by several small islands just above sea level that acted pretty much like natural sponges whenever high tides came in. But the government completely destroyed them by filling the entire area in to cover it all up for industry. And to make matters more worse, a navigable channel was dug across the lagoon that allowed large, modern oil tankers to reach the new industrial district. This artificial channel directly connected the lagoon with the sea, which obviously didn't exist at the time of Venice's foundation thousands of years ago, and it's just become another entry point for high tides and storm surges coming into the lagoon from the Adriatic. Modern studies have indicated that Venice is still sinking at a rate of about 1 to 2 millimeters per year, and over the past decade, global sea levels were rising at a rate of about 3.6 millimeters per year, meaning that Venice's actual sea level rise is above the global average because of their sinking problem. Back when modern flooding records of Venice began in 1872, there was only one severe flooding event before 1950 in the city where the water reached a height of 1.4 meters above sea level. From 1950 until today, however, which is nearly an equivalent amount of time, there have been 21 of these severe flooding events recorded, with more and more happening every new decade. Of the top 10 highest floods measured in Venice since records began, 4 of them took place in 2019, and the biggest of them in November was so large it covered more than 80% of the city and damaged multiple cultural heritage sites. In fact, the centerpiece of Venice, St. Mark's Square, now regularly floods more than 60 times a year, which way back in 1900 only happened 4 times. So now in the 21st century, Venice's ambitious plan to fight back against the ocean and geography is called the Modulo Sperimentale Elettromeccanico, or MOSE system. Essentially, this is a huge system that's designed to hold back the rising tides of the Adriatic during high tide in order to better protect the city. And after multiple delays, it's finally nearly finished. The system consists of several rows of large gates located at each of the 3 natural inlets that lead into the Venetian lagoon, with the majority of the gates located at the Lido Inlet, closest to the city of Venice itself. There are 78 of these gates in total across all 3 of the inlets that are each around 20 meters wide and up to 30 meters in length for the deepest sections. Under normal tidal conditions, the gates will remain full of water and rest within their respective housing structures down on the sea floor. But whenever a high tide coming in from the Adriatic is forecasted and the lagoon needs to be defended, the gates will rapidly be drained of water and filled up with compressed air so they shoot back up to the surface and then stop the tide from surging into the lagoon. And then, once the high tide is over with, the gates will once again be filled up with water and return back down to the seafloor below and allow boats and the natural flow of water above to move about. The ultimate goal here is to leave the gates open as much as possible and allow the natural rhythm between the lagoon and the sea to continue, and to only raise them up when absolutely necessary. But the system has not come without controversy. For one thing, the schedule and costs have been severely overblown. When it was initially proposed, MOSE was supposed to be a 10-year project and cost 4.2 billion euros. Construction began way back in 2003, and it's expected to finally finish only now at the end of this year in 2021. more than 8 years behind schedule and more than 1.3 billion euros over budget. Back in 2014, 35 people, including the then mayor of Venice, were all arrested by the Italian police on corruption charges in connection with the MOSE project. Multiple environmental groups, including the World Wildlife Foundation, have repeatedly made negative comments about the project. And while the supporters of MOSE claim that it will be capable of handling the threats of rising sea levels from climate change, many others doubt it. While the gates could always just theoretically be raised to block out rising sea levels, they could only do so by raising the gate so often that they'd probably just end up functioning more as a near-permanent wall. By being raised nearly all of the time, the lagoon's natural drainage and interchange with the Adriatic Sea will be completely destroyed, and the lagoon surrounding Venice will inevitably become just a gross, stagnant pool of garbage and algae. Unfortunately, though, that may be the only possible solution that exists to save Venice. It's been estimated before that just a 50-centimeter rise in sea levels will pretty much permanently doom Venice beneath the waves. And in 2019, the famous IPCC report projected a rise of 600 to 1,100 centimeters in sea levels by the year 2100 if greenhouse gas emissions remain the very same as they are today. By the end of this century, Venice is probably either going to become the 21st century's Atlantis, or it's going to be stuck inside of a blocked-off and stagnant lagoon that's full of algae and trash, and there doesn't really seem to be many good alternative third choices. And throughout all of this, the pace of tourists coming to visit the already drowning and crowded city isn't seeming to go down either, despite the global pandemic. With pent-up global demand for international travel at an all-time high, the number of tourists who will visit the city in 2025 is projected to soar towards 38 million people, a number that many Venetians consider to be grossly unsustainable. That would mean on an average day in 2025, there would be nearly one tourist for every 2 residents in the small 5-square-kilometer city. These extremely high levels of over-tourism are creating overcrowding and even further environmental problems for the ecosystem around the fragile lagoon. The entire city of Venice and its lagoon are considered a World Heritage Site by UNESCO, and because of its rampant over-tourism, UNESCO was considering placing the city on its in danger list, which usually only includes historical ruins in war-torn countries like Syria or Iraq. Earlier in June of 2021, UNESCO narrowly avoided placing Venice on the list because the Italian government finally banned the passage of large cruise ships entering in through the city's historic center. But that's pretty much just a minor step in solving Venice's tremendous problems. In the end, all of the engineering and policies in the world may not be enough to match the overwhelming firepower that nature is bringing to Venice this century. I think that ultimately, save for taking Venice and pushing it somewhere else, I'm not really certain about Venice's future, and neither is anybody else. Because in the end, no amount of technology can possibly overcome the fact that Venice is located on a chain of sinking islands in the middle of a marshy lagoon, while the water besieging it from the outside is getting higher and higher all the time. And while the MOSE system is not yet fully 100% complete, it has already been deployed to save Venice. In October last year in 2020, the seawalls were deployed for the very first time to defend the city against a storm surge in the Adriatic, and it worked pretty effectively. A lot of what's happening today is based on what happened yesterday, last year, or last century, and even beyond. Keeping up with current events is essential to understanding the way that our world works. And I get to do that every day by reading all the short articles that are posted to Morning Brew every morning. And this is what I love the most about using Morning Brew. Their free daily newsletter gets you up to speed on all the current events and news that you need to know in business, finance, and tech in only 5 minutes, and in a way that's way more relevant, informative, and frankly witty than traditional news. For example, in this past week, I got to read about the US's plan to reopen for international travel, what's in the United States infrastructure bill, and Rivian's huge IPO. Since you watch Real Life Lore, I know that you like getting a bit smarter and staying better informed, and regular, repeatable patterns of learning are exactly the best way to do that. So go ahead and start your mornings with Morning Brew by subscribing completely for free when you click the button that's on your screen right now or by following the link that's down in the description. It's one of the absolute best ways that you can help support this channel completely for free, and you get to stay up to date with current events and be a better informed person. It's seriously a huge win-win, and as always, thank you so much for watching.